give you a little bit more details about my background, and that's partly because, I'm talking to you as an expert, but you should always question experts. Okay? Especially experts talking about complex things with human implications, and especially experts talking outside their area of expertise. So you can be an expert in physics and talk about, genes for intelligence. You can be full of So not everybody who's brilliant in one field knows everything about everything else. Particularly in the human sciences, nobody knows anything. Okay, so let's be frank. But insofar as there are experts, I'm an expert, but you have a right to demand evidence. If I'm telling you something you don't think is right, you have a right to demand some evidence for that. So I'm prepared to give you some evidence. I think you should always be careful about experts telling you things you want to hear. So I'm going to tell you some things you probably don't want to hear. So I don't have to worry about that. But I want to first do a little bit of history. Okay? How did we get to thinking about things this way? So I think most of you would, not think of yourselves as particularly Christian. But a lot of our ways of thinking, how long ago was it that all of Western Europe was Christian? Not so long ago, maybe 100 years or so ago, maybe up until the First World War. The ways of thinking about humanity that Christianity and Neoplatonism nurtured for 2,000 years didn't just evaporate overnight. We like to think of the Enlightenment as our sort of intellectual forebears, but the concepts they had about free will and about the individual were largely derived from Christian ideas that were current at their time. When we talk about behavior being genetically determined, we're essentially trying to contradict the idea of free will and saying, did you have a choice about your behaviors? I'm going to say, what probably most of you already think, maybe not all of you, but most sensible people don't worry about this question. Free will is not an issue that you worry about in everyday life. Is there anybody who worries about free will? A handful, okay. A couple of people. Good, I would worry about it if most of you did. When we come before the justice of the peace, then we talk a lot about free will, then it matters. Yeah. Okay? So, but in common sense, we think typically how we behave depends both on what we bring to a situation and what the situation demands of us. So I want to talk first a little bit about genes, a little bit of biology for 2 minutes. So all of you've all heard of DNA. We have roughly 3 billion base pairs of DNA in each of our cells. So that 3 billion base pairs, if you stretched it all out, one molecule would be about this wide. And that is all wrapped up in each cell of your body, in each of the 10 or 20 trillion cells of your body, is all wrapped up into a tiny dot so small that you could not see it. And you could not even see it with the kind of microscope that you had in high school. You need a very strong microscope to even see the dot, but all of that is sort of tangled up in sort of like spaghetti. As I said, each cell has about 3 billion bases. By and large, if you look at my genome and you look at your genome, they're pretty much the same. But we differ. Now here we're a somewhat racially diverse group, I think, but then we would say that if we were to look at all the places we differ in our genomes, it would be about 1 in every 300 bases. If we were just looking at people of European ancestry, it would be about 1 in every 700 bases. So Africans have much more diversity, much more variation in the genome. When I talk about a variation, I mean, you may have one base, there's 4 bases, so at a particular position, let's say position 31,482,282 on chromosome 10, particular coordinate, think of it like a map coordinate, you may have an A and I may have a G in that same position. Or you may have a C and I may have a T in that position. Now, so if you can do a little math, if we're differing at about 1 every 300 bases, and you get 3 billion bases, well, you can do a little math. You think that's about 10 million variants that are fairly common. Then there's uncommon variants. So each of us, when we're born, have between 50 and 80 mutations that are absolutely novel, that our parents didn't have. Most of them are in the vast desert of what we call junk DNA, stuff that really hardly matters at all. But typically 1 or 2 of them are in places that actually matter. And they may give us slightly different complexion, or they may give us slightly better or worse hemoglobin, or perhaps some easier time or harder time breathing. So we typically have about 50 to 80 of those, and of course that's cumulative, that's accumulating over generations. Those mutations that are advantageous tend to spread, and those mutations that aren't tend to die out. All right, well, let's start with controversial issues. Okay, so I think most of you heard endlessly about IQ, and of course, in the United States, if you say someone is smart, that's about the highest compliment you can pay them. So we take IQ very seriously in this country. Not every country takes it so seriously. Not every culture takes it so seriously. But in America, because we're so focused on success, being smart is just the key ingredient to a successful life. Of course, it becomes quite an issue. Are you fated to be smart like you are, or aren't? Or are you, can people be changed? So of course, if you're working in the Soviet Union in the mid-1930s, everything is environmental. This new Soviet man, so to speak, can become anything that the government wants the Soviet person to be.
Yeah, but isn't that also the American dream? I mean, it's like, you can be anything you set your mind to, and, okay, obviously I'm an immigrant. I find that pretty funny.
And most, people from most parts of the world find that pretty funny, or at least a lot. But we take it for granted. Of course, in the mid-20th century, most sort of liberal opinion, educated opinion, was that it was largely, your circumstances, your society that contributed mostly to intelligence. But then during the mid-20th century and going forward, a number of people did studies of heritability. That is, they looked at if you compare 2 people within the same environment, that is, let's say the same family, and you can get people who share 100% of their DNA, and you can get people who share 25% of their DNA. So basically, if you have an identical twin, you share virtually 100% of your DNA. If you have a brother or sister, you share 25%. If IQ is largely determined by genes, what do you think would happen?
One would be smart and one would be not so smart.
Well,
Right.
the twins.
Yeah, so it would say basically, you could have smart twins and you could have not so smart twins, but if one twin was smart, the other one would have to be if it was largely genes.
Yeah.
And if one was not so smart, the other would have to be not so smart. So they would be very closely correlated. But if you looked at brothers and sisters, not so much. Be mildly correlated, they share 25. On the other hand, if it was largely environmental, you'd see kids from one family being all smart together, and kids from another family being all not so smart together. The way to do this, seemed to be, let's go out and measure. So, lots of kids took IQ tests, and lots of twins took IQ tests. Starting in the 70s and then in the 80s, it became pretty much, the scientific consensus that most of IQ was due to genes, because kids who were twins had very close IQs, but brothers and sisters typically had not so close IQs. And it seemed like an open and shut case. I mean, who could argue with that, right? Does anyone want to argue?
Well, of course, you know,
this
the
room?
twins that were raised together, they would also be raised in the same environment and so have the same stimulation, so maybe they're closer in IQ than those that were raised separately. And so, you know, you can't really make that distinction between nature and
But
nurture.
presumably the brothers and sisters are also raised in the same environment.
So how does that go when you got supposedly identical twins, but one's female, one's male?
They're not
You
identical.
can't have identical
Not
twins.
identical.
Yeah.
They were born,
You consider them like
That's
brothers.
fraternal.
They're fraternal.
Those are so-called fraternal twins.
Yeah,
Okay.
Because I have an identical twin sister. And so, you know, presumably our IQ is similar. But I have a college degree and an advanced degree and she dropped out. But, you know, so that's IQ. Her IQ may be very similar to mine. But, you know, nurture does play a role in, you know, what happens later in life. You know, what choices you make, what influences you and so on. So you can't make a decision on success in that regard.
I think that's fair to say that, you know, all that was being claimed was that IQ was largely determined by genes. Of course, you know, your life trajectory is going to determine what you do with it. Up until about, maybe 10 years ago, the official word was that IQ was largely genetic. And then that spawned lots of controversies, especially racial controversies, because in the United States, at least, African Americans don't typically do as well on IQ tests as white Americans. So we had huge controversies about this.
It's because they're made by white people.
Sorry?
The tests are made for white people, not dark people.
That's certainly part of it. We got into a lot of mess thinking that you know, IQ was largely determined by genes. But the proof of the pudding would be, can we find the specific genes? So the whole point of the Human Genome Project was to find the specific genes that underlay all these kinds of traits. 2000, the human genome was more or less done. People started looking systematically for these genes. And it turns out that now, you know, we used to think there might be a handful of genes that determine whether you're smart or not so smart, a handful of these genetic variants. Well, it turns out that we can't find any genetic variants that determine, you know, more than 1% of whether you're, you know, of your variation in IQ. In fact, we can't even find any genes that determine more than 0.1% of variation in IQ score. And at this point, you know, we've been looking pretty hard. We've got samples of millions of people. It's pretty much a done deal. We do not have it. There are no common gene variants that determine your IQ, and certainly none that contribute more than about 0.1% to your IQ score.
Would that be the same for other kinds of qualities? Or what I'm thinking of is two of my offspring, way down, are identical twins. They look identical, they appear to be the same, but one is very aggressive and one is very passive. In every other way, they seem similar. Would you connect that to something in the genes, or you think, would there be another factor?
If I were a genetic counselor and you were coming to me with that issue, I would say I would want to look at where they might differ. So we say that identical twins share all their DNA. That's not quite true. Remember, each of us gets 50 to 80 new mutations. Those are different for the two identical twins.
So you're still associated with the genes?
But there is
So
also,
I
you
would
know,
still look
there
at
are other
certain-
dynamics at play, you know. One of the twins may be heavier and stronger than the other, and that may early on determine the hierarchy that one is more aggressive.
I think that's a fair point.
So it's,
It's
that's
like basketball players, you know, that a lot of basketball players were born sort of in the oldest month that they would be eligible for playing in a particular league. And so they're taller than their peers, they get past the ball more often, they just get better because they get the ball more often. So if it's mostly genetic, we should be able to look at a newborn baby's DNA and predict their IQ.
But
So
the
what-
absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, just because we haven't found any genes or correlations that doesn't mean that.
Well, we can, yeah, but we know how we know what effect sizes we would find.
Mhm.
So we found several hundred at this point. We expect there are several thousand, but the effect sizes are getting smaller and smaller the more we find. So, you know, the big ones are 1/10%. The little ones are like 1/100th of 1%. And what we would like to be able to do, if we want to say a trait is genetic or inborn, we would like to be able to read someone's DNA, take a newborn's DNA and say, okay, this kid is going to have an IQ of, you know, 120 or 105, and, you know, be more or less right. But we can't do that.
That's not gonna work. That's not gonna work for certain areas like Flint. I'll just pick Flint.
Well, okay,
That's where I live.
for
Like lead poisoning, you know, certain areas of the world. I'm just not talking here. There's so many of those environmental factors that right at birth, you're not gonna be able to do that.
I think that's a fair criticism, and that is a criticism, you know, that's a legitimate criticism of this whole enterprise, which is nevertheless the scientific orthodoxy. And may I point out something that there was a paper recently sort of aggregating all of the variants for IQ. Guess what the lead variant was? Nothing to do with your brain. It's how much lead you could pump out of your lungs. So lead transporter is the lead, you know, the most, you know, about 1/10%, that's a lead transporter. And that's reflecting the fact that people have been living near, you know, metalworking facilities for a long time. It's not the lead, you know, it's not the Flint uniquely. People were living near metal refining for many hundreds of years. And if you could get rid of that lead that you were breathing in, you would have a higher IQ. So it's nothing to do with the brain. So at this point, it's still not possible to predict accurately someone's IQ from their genes. Let's talk about something else. So heritability of psychiatric disorders. So again, the official word now is that most serious psychiatric disorders have a strong genetic basis. Again, if you look at heritability estimates, you know, if you have an identical twin who's schizophrenic, you have about a 50% chance of being schizophrenic yourself. If you don't, if you have no relatives who are schizophrenic, you have a less than 1% chance of being schizophrenic. So this suggests strong genetic component, except we can't find any genes that have very strong effect.
Wow.
The really strong effect genes give you, you know, might move you from a 0.8% chance of being schizophrenic to a 1.1% chance of schizophrenia.
What about alcoholism?
You know, again, we can't find a lot, but the ones we can find really aren't relative to the brain. They're how you metabolize alcohol. So you notice a lot of Asian people will not drink a lot of alcohol. Why is that?
They can't metabolize that.
Because they can't metabolize it, and it builds up and gives them an uncomfortable feeling. And it turns out that actually most of the genetic factors that protect against alcoholism are like that. That they're something that makes drinking unpleasant for you rather than something that's different about your brain. You know, we've been looking at things like IQ, psychiatric disorders, which are things, you know, IQ is something that's so important for success in America. You know, psychiatric disorders are so troubling to people especially the people who have to live with them. But we don't generally talk about, you know, being an asshole. You know, it turns out that being an asshole is actually pretty heritable. Obviously, I touched a nerve here. But we can actually find some of the genes involved in, you know, being a serious asshole. Or its converse, we can find some of the genes involved in being empathic and being caring. Despite the fact that these are not very hot topics of research, even in small studies, we can find large effects. So when I say a large effect, I'm talking like 2% or 4%, which is 20 or 30 times the biggest effects we found on all these other phenotypes, all these other traits. They're still not big. There's 2 genes that are now pretty convincingly linked with extreme violence. So again, if you have all the risk variants, or the 2 that we know of, for violence, your probability of becoming extremely violent only goes up a few percent. Going from basically, you know, about 1% of people, you know, do something very violent in their lives. And that may go up to 2 or 3% if you have both of these variants. So again, it's not fate, but that's the biggest ratio that we found for any trait relative to a gene. And again, if you have the variants that are related to empathy, it explains about 4% of the variance in empathy scores. That's again a huge effect compared to all the others, but it's still, you can't look at somebody and say, at someone's DNA and say, okay, that person's going to be empathic. I'd like to look at, something that I think really does explain much more of the heritability of so many of these traits, and that is some peculiarities of human brain evolution. If you look at a human brain and you look at a chimp brain, they look pretty much the same from the outside, except of course, one's a lot bigger. Our brain is 3 times bigger than a chimp brain. Our bodies are a little bigger too, so maybe a better comparison's a gorilla who has the same body size as we do, and our brains are twice the size of a typical gorilla's brain. So we're a little bigger. Not a huge difference. I mean, people have brains in different sizes too, and it's not terribly well correlated with IQ. Is there a new brain region? Do we have some sort of, brain region that is special that the chimps don't have? Well, we don't. In fact, you can find virtually all of our brain regions in a monkey. And nobody thinks monkeys are particularly intellectual. And in fact, you can even find Broca's area in chimps, and they use it for different purposes. That's our language area. It's not that we have some sort of new brain region or component, a sort of secret, soul station in the middle of our brain somewhere that gives us our special capability. We've been looking for the special part for the last 20 years. I've been in a couple of those studies. We haven't found the special part, but we have found something else that's interesting. So let me draw your attention to one region that both humans and chimps have, except that ours have grown disproportionately. So roughly speaking, if you scale up a chimp brain by a factor of 3, you'll get, roughly speaking, a human brain, with a couple of exceptions. So we don't have proportionally as much of our cortex devoted to motion, moving our arms and sensation, and we make up for some of that by having more cortex devoted to sort of integrating different ideas. A particular area of cortex that we have a lot more of is this ventromedial prefrontal cortex that is just behind your eyebrows, between your eyes, and it's what we call a medial. So remember, the brain is sort of folded around like this, and a part of the brain you rarely see from the outside are these medial areas, but they're actually pretty important for emotion and sort of self-awareness. We have a much bigger area like that. Coming from this area, we have a lot of neurons called spindle cells, or if you want the technical name, von Economo neurons, and they are very large neurons that can pass information at very high speed from this ventromedial prefrontal cortex to every other part of the brain. So not only do we have a much bigger area, it's much better connected to, or sending more messages to every other part of the brain. What is this ventromedial prefrontal cortex doing? Well, we don't know. That's, you're going to get used to that answer, right? But we do know that if you ask people to reflect on, let's say, a close loved one, let's say a parent or a spouse, put in a scanner, you put them in a brain scanner, you ask them about a close relationship, this area will become very active, especially if you ask them about what would cause that close one to reject you. Then that area becomes really active. If you ask people to solve a hard moral problem, would you, kill one person to save 5 kind of problem, then that area becomes very active. So again, we don't know what it does. We just know whatever it does, it's recruited in these kinds of sort of fundamental relational situations, social situations, especially about sort of moral and ethical issues. So that's, of course, where you feel guilty. So that area is pretty important, and it's if you're looking at what made human evolution possible, well, let me ask you a question. So most of you sleep in beds, I imagine. So let's say you're camping out, as our ancestors did. Where would you be sleeping?
In an art camper?
On the ground. Okay, I think.
Well, chimpanzees make a nest out of leaves and other soft material
Right, and where do they put that nest?
on the ground.
No.
In the trees.
So it depends.
All chimps sleep in the trees. They make nests on trees. Why do they do that? Why do they climb a tree? I mean, they can climb trees, but they don't like to.
That's what they say.
Protection.
Predators.
Because there are leopards prowling around the jungle. It's not that the leopard can't climb trees, but they'll make a lot of noise. And they're relatively safe up in the trees. But if you're on the ground, you are a sitting duck. You will get eaten that night.
That's right.
All right, so let's rewind our evolution 2 million years. Where were our ancestors sleeping?
On caves.
No, they were not in caves. Caves were occasionally. Have you tried sleeping in a cave?
No, not ways.
No, I mean, if you have a choice, unless it's pouring rain, you're going to be sleeping on the ground. Our ancestors were sleeping on the ground. By that time, they had fire. How are they going to avoid getting eaten?
My ancestors mostly snored and kept
Scared the poor animals away. There you go.
Have you ever met a lion who was scared by snoring? My impression is that most lions just don't give a damn whether you snore or not, so long as you taste good. So, speak up.
having a night guard.
Right. For millions of years, we've had somebody staying awake, watching for the lions or the leopards or, believe me, you don't care whether it's a lion or a leopard. We're basically small, juicy primates without shells. We are just delicious on the average big cat's menu. So, so we had somebody standing guard, and that was critical. Do chimpanzees ever stand guard for each other?
No.
Not very often.
It's everyone for themselves.
So it's this motivation. Have you ever tried to stay awake all night staying guard? This is hard work.
That's hard.
So you have to be very strongly motivated and compelled by obligation or loyalty. Or fear. Some combination of it. So, but remember, most of the time the leopards don't come because you're awake. You can maybe hear them very distantly off. You are trusting your life to somebody, but you also have an obligation to all of your small group. So one of the key areas for this kind of loyalty and obligation to others is this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So that is a key ingredient.